Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the series of lectures about the book Initiation into Spiritism by Teresina Oliveira and now translated into English by Helton Matar Monteiro. So I'm so excited to be here with you all today and talking about one of these lessons. I am Bia, and I live in New York, but I attend the Allan Kardec Spiritist Center of Danbury, Connecticut, and I teach a study at that center. So today, I'm excited to bring to you lesson 6 of the book, Love of God and Neighbor. So let's get right into it. So this lesson starts off with the Greatest Commandment and this passage here. So let's read it together. And behold, a lawyer stood to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law of God? In the law, how do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. So this passage, I think, is one that we're all very familiar with, and we've heard this many times, I believe. So we know this concept, right, of love your Lord, love God, and love your neighbor as yourself. I feel like we've all heard that so many times, but have we really taken the moment to really dive deep into what this message is bringing us and what this message really means, into the context of the time period, right? Putting ourselves in the time of Jesus. What was happening at this time? And that is what I love so much about this book, is that it gets these passages that even if we know them, it breaks them down and brings us points that we might have never thought about before. And it opens up a new clarity and makes it easy to understand these messages. So that's what I love about this book. And I'm really excited to show how that works for this lesson for you all today. And one thing I do want to point out is that all the things that are on the slides are directly from the book. So, of course, while we're talking together, I'm going to be adding in my own comments, but everything that is on the slides is directly from the book. So then what the book gets into is explaining this message, right? So the first thing that they give is a definition of the word lawyer, which seems a little funny, right? Because we all know what a lawyer is, right? A lawyer is someone who's guiding societal laws, right? Is very knowledgeable in guiding and protecting the laws of our society. So, why do they have to define what a lawyer is? So if we get into it, the definition that they bring here is it's a man of the sect of the Pharisees, well acquainted with the law of Moses and with the teachings of the prophets, and of the holy writings of the Jews. So, right, automatically you see that, okay, that's not the lawyer that we think it is, right? That's not exactly the same thing as we know today in our society. So the first thing I want to point out is, of course, we're talking about here the holy writing of the Jews, because in that time, right, in Jesus's time period and regional area that he was in, right, Judaism was the main religion. So, of course, when we're talking here, right, we're talking about the holy writings of the Jews. So let's get into that section in the beginning about a man of the sect of the Pharisees. So what does that really mean? So in the time, right, even though it was all within Judaism, there was people would have different ideas. They would have conflicting ideas. And even though it was still Judaism, right, they were still all considering themselves Jewish, but they had some different ideas. And because of that, they would separate into smaller groups, into little groups. So those are sects, which we can think of sections, right? So those are smaller groups that were created, still all under the branch of Judaism. Well, the Pharisees, they were one of the most dominant, most influential of these groups. So the Pharisees was one of these sects that had a little bit of a different belief, so they split up because of disputes that they were having, but they were one of the most influential. So it wasn't just a small little section, it was one of the most influential, biggest ones. So we can see that here a lawyer in this sense, is someone from, right, the most influential group, if we're talking, right, the most influential group, and not about societal laws, but about the religious laws, right? The laws like saying here, Moses, of the prophets, of the holy writings of the Jews. So it's someone that's knowledgeable about the religious laws, not the societal laws. Another thing I want to point out is that when we get, once we go evolving, right, our laws will become God's laws, right? They will be the same. But right now, we know that we're not perfect. And in that time, they weren't perfect. So the laws are not the same. So that's why it's not, that's why we have that difference between societal laws and these religious laws, these laws of God. One day we'll get so that they're both the same. And in which case, all of the lawyer will be the same. But in this case, right, it was specifically someone talking about the religious laws, very knowledgeable. So now the next phrase that it brings here for us to define is eternal life. So usually when we think of eternal life, and when we're not thinking of a spiritist sense, eternal life, when people say they want eternal life, usually they're talking about life after death, right? They want that happiness, that life after death. They want to keep living forever. But when we flip that, right, as spiritists, we know that our spirit does go on to live forever. So the book brings us this definition here. It's the life of the spirit, which does not finish, unlike that of the body, in fullness and happiness. So, right, again, we know as spiritists that our spirit is going to continue, right? It's not going to finish. While our physical body will finish, our spirit is not going to finish. It's not going to have the end. So then we get to the question, okay, well then why is the lawyer asking for eternal life if we know that all spirits are going to live forever? So why ask for that? The key here, the difference is this fullness and happiness. So fullness is like getting all the knowledge, right? Like all of the puzzle pieces coming together. You're complete, you're full. And happiness, right? Of course, we know what happiness is. So getting to the state of being complete and being happy. So it's not just about living forever when we're talking about eternal life. It's about living in that happiness, living forever in that happiness, in that state of perfection, right? Which is what we're all aiming towards. But that's why it's not just asking, how can I get to life after death, but asking, right, that eternal happiness. How are we going to get there? So then the next section that it brings here is stood up to put him to the test. So why do they point this out, right? Why do they define this? So he, the lawyer, was not seeking any spiritual guidance. That is, he was trying to see if Jesus would teach him anything contrary to Jewish law. So, right, if this man, right, this lawyer is very knowledgeable about the religious laws, then he wasn't really asking this question to Jesus for knowledge, right, to get advice. He was trying to test Jesus. He was trying to put Jesus to a test. And of course, right, we think now, oh my God, how could someone ever go up to Jesus and test him, right, and question him? But think about at that time period, again, right, put ourselves in their shoes. And that time period, right, this was a random man that they didn't have any encounters with, right? And they didn't know. They wanted to test, right? Okay, this man says he, right, knows all these things, right? But does he really? Is he going to say something contrary? So they wanted to test. They were skeptical, of course. And people still are skeptical today, right? But so you can understand a little bit more why the lawyer would be really testing Jesus as to now, right? It seems kind of crazy to ever be doing that. To test Jesus. But so that's important comment here that he stood to put Jesus to the test. He was trying to test what Jesus would say. So then we get into the main part here of the message that is what we all initially know and think about is what is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind and your neighbor as yourself. So I think this is the main part that comes to mind, right? When we think love God, love your neighbor as yourself, or we think of this. But there are some things to point out here that what is written in the law? So again, right, we're not talking about the societal laws. We're talking about the religious laws, God's law. That's what we're talking about when Jesus refers to the law. And what I find interesting is that Jesus really flips the question back to the lawyer. The lawyer was trying to test Jesus, but Jesus flips that question back and asks the lawyer. And the lawyer answered beautifully, right? Because we know he has this knowledge. He knows that we have to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. And the comment they bring is that this is the so-called greatest commandment, because this encompasses and sums up all the others. So think about that, right? If we love God, if we love our neighbor as ourselves, then everything else is going to come into place, because we are not going to kill, we are not going to steal, we are not going to commit adultery, we are not going to do any of those things if we are truly loving and connecting with God. And by loving and connecting with God, that means we're loving everything that God created, which is all of the other beings, right? Which is all the other spirits. So we are loving our neighbor as well. So that is why this is seen as the greatest commandment, right? Because if we do this one thing, which isn't as easy as it sounds, if we do this one thing, then all those other things will fall into place, and we will naturally be doing all those other good things. So that is why this lesson is so important to us, right? How can we follow this law? So now Jesus answered, after the lawyer gave that response, right? So beautifully said, Jesus said, yes, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. So, right, first Jesus is saying, right, you answered correctly, right? Again, flipping that test on saying, like, I was testing you and you answered correctly, right? Telling the lawyer that he answered correctly. And the important part here, right, that we don't really focus on, but is a message we should be focusing on, is do this and you will live. Because again, the question was, what shall I do? Right? So it's not just what do I need to know, it's what shall I do? And Jesus is saying, do this, do what you're saying. If you put into practice what you're saying, then you will achieve that eternal life, that happiness. But it's not enough to just know. And that's where the book brings in this comment, that the lawyer had knowledge. He knew what to do to live the spiritual life well and fully, if only he acted according to what he already knew. So, right, again, the lawyer was someone very intelligent and knowledgeable in the laws of God, in the religious laws. So he was so knowledgeable, but what does he need to do? He needs to practice those, right? It's not enough to just have all that knowledge. It's a great thing to have all that knowledge. That's definitely a great step. But to really do that, we need to put that into action, right? To really conquer those things, we need to put them into action. We need to try to practice those things. Just knowing them is not enough. And this is where, and sorry, just going back a second here. So this is where we think about, then what about us, right? Because again, we think so much about the lawyer, and it's easy for us to judge, right? We're like, oh, okay, this lawyer, right? He needs to start practicing. But what about us, right? Do we know this law? Then we should be practicing it as well, right? Because I'm pretty sure many of us have heard, right, this love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But even if we haven't, if this is your first time hearing it, well, now you know it, right? Now because of this discussion, we all know it. We're all acknowledging it. So now we're all responsible for acting on it, for doing those things, for acting on that concept of loving God and loving our neighbor, right? And then all those other commandments will also fall into place. So, and that's why there is the saying that ignorance is bliss, which means, right, that if you don't know something, you don't have to act upon it. But now that you know it, you have to act upon it, and it's going to be harder, right? But it doesn't mean that we don't want that. We want that because we want to challenge ourselves, to improve ourselves, to grow, and that's what's going to get us closer to that state of happiness. So that is what we want. We're aiming for it, right? But it's easy to think that it would be much easier to not know something, because if you don't know it, you don't have to act on it. But now that we're talking about this here all together, right, we all know this. So now we all have to act on it, myself included. So now let's read this over again one more time with these new definitions, right, to get a better understanding. So, and behold, a lawyer, someone very knowledgeable, right, in religious laws, stood to put Jesus to the test. He wasn't asking for guidance. He knew the answer, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" So that happiness, that perfection, that happiness after death, after this physical death. He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" So what is written in God's law, in the religious laws? And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." So do this and you will live. But of course, right, we're all going to live. It's live that spiritual happiness, right? That perfection, that happiness that we're all striving for. Because we know that even once we get to the spirit world, we're still going to have to be working and improving ourselves. But it's living with that happiness, that complete, full happiness. So then the book brings us here it continues this passage a little bit. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In response, Jesus told a parable. So the lawyer came to test Jesus. So he was kind of not satisfied that Jesus answered that one correctly or agreed with him. So he's trying to test Jesus again, right? So desiring to justify himself, he's saying, okay, so who is my neighbor? Because again, right, it was love your neighbor as yourself. So in response, Jesus told a parable. So the book comes and gives us the definition of a parable, which is important. So a parable is a short symbolic or comparative story, an allegory, beneath which lies an important truth, and which carries in its conclusion a moral perception or rule of conduct to be followed in a given situation. So we know that Jesus always tended to speak in parables, in short stories, because that was understandable for the people at the time, right? If he came to the people of the time, even to us today, and said, "Here's a textbook, read this whole textbook and you'll know everything," it would be very hard, right, to convince people to read a textbook, for them to understand it. But when you give short, simple stories that people can resonate with, that people can understand right off the bat, then they'll be able to get that knowledge faster and be able to act on it faster. So that's why Jesus spoke in these short stories that were easy to understand. But Jesus wasn't just storytelling, right? An important part of this definition, beneath it lies an important truth. So while on the surface it might just seem like a nice story, beneath it, right, there is something important for us to learn from that message. So it's not just that Jesus was telling stories. They did have those important lessons, those important teachings behind them, but it was the best way for us to understand them rather than just giving a list of all the teachings. So now we get into the parable of the Good Samaritan. So this is the parable that Jesus answered this question to from the lawyer. So let's read this once, and then again, the book is going to go through and give us some clarifying definitions that are really going to help put into perspective what this story is really about. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw that man, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." So from that story, right, I think we can get the gist of it, right? We can understand that, wow, that person was the one who stopped and who helped that man, and that man was being a neighbor. But if we dig into this a little deeper, it'll it will be shocking. It was shocking to me, right? How much clearer this message becomes when we get a little background knowledge of that time period, of what really Jesus was referencing. So the first word here that they define in the book is a priest. So similar to the lawyer, right? We think, okay, we know what a lawyer is, we know what a priest is, but a priest, right, at the today, right, we know someone in the Catholic Church that has a higher authority. But in this time, it was the person in charge of the Jewish cult in the Temple of Jerusalem. So the priest, again, right, at that time, that main religion in that area was Judaism. So we are talking about the Jewish religion. And it was this person in charge. And the important thing here is that the Temple of Jerusalem was not just a small little church in a town. The Temple of Jerusalem was a main worshiping center, right? So it wasn't that this priest was just someone that ran a small local church, right? But ran a big thing. So that means a lot of people really looked up to this priest, right? They were they were in charge of the main center of worship, right? Imagine how highly looked upon the priest was. So that puts us into context a little bit of who this priest really was, right? Someone you really, really looked up to in society. So now the next one that it brings us is a Levite. So who was the Levite? The Levite is the assistant to the priest in the worship in the temple. So, right, imagine we have this main temple, right, the main temple, then we have the priest who's in charge of it all. So imagine, right, how highly looked upon that priest is. And now we have the Levites who are assistants to the priest. So again, imagine how highly looked upon they are just for being the assistant to the priest. So, right, just there in itself, they had a lot of merit and people looked up to them because they assisted the priest. So these are two, right, really highly looked upon figures in religion at the time. And now we get on to the Samaritan, right, which is the title of this story. So the Samaritan is from Samaria, the ancient Jews who inhabited this region. They came to be considered by the Jews of Jerusalem as bad people. So first off, from Samaria. So that gives us some context to why there's the name Samaritan, right? It's the people from Samaria, the same way that we say New Yorkers are people from New York, right? So the Samaritans are people from the area of Samaria. So, but in this area, there were these ancient Jews. So the ancient Jews were there and they were accepted by society. But then foreigners came and started living in Samaria. So these cultures started blending. And because these cultures started blending, the other Jews who were very serious about their worship and who did not mix with other cultures, they got mad, right? They didn't like that those ancient Jews were letting their culture mix. So because they didn't like that, they started labeling Samaritans as bad people. They didn't like the Samaritans. They didn't let them come to the Temple of Jerusalem. So this group got really outcasted and people didn't like it and just had a bad reputation because they mixed with the foreigners and had that cultural overlap, which we know, right? That cultural overlap happens anywhere where we have two cultures mixing, right? It wasn't even intentional that the Samaritans let that happen, but this happened, and because of that, the Jews of Jerusalem, the other Jews, really banned those people, didn't like them, said mean things to them. So that gives us a little context here of who the Samaritan was. So why in the story does Jesus use Samaritan, right? Think about it. This is someone that, and if we think about the lawyer is probably one of these people that also thought badly of Samaritans, right? Because the lawyer was in this society and he was very knowledgeable about religion. So he was probably one of those people that were against the Samaritans. So why have this, right? Have the Good Samaritan? It's because, right, Jesus was fighting that prejudice that we all have, and that the lawyer and the people of the time had towards the Samaritans. right? Because just because the Samaritans were seen as bad people doesn't mean that they were, right? People were just judging them the same way that still exists today, that we all judge other people. Just because, right, you judge a book by its cover, just one thing that happened, you judge this person, in the end, right, that Samaritan is good and maybe better, right, than the people who you do consider good. So it just goes to show our judgment of character and how we kind of pick and choose, right, who we're going to love or to help. But it's not about that, right? Because as you can see here in this case, right, the Samaritan was the one who was good. And for the lawyer, he wouldn't think that, right? He would think the opposite. He would think that the priest and the Levite would be the ones to help. So then it brings us the definition of a man. And of course, right, you think, okay, a man, I definitely know the definition of a man. But what they bring here as the definition is a human being in an hour of need. So what's important that they want to point out here is that this was not, they don't define who this man was. They don't define the race, the religion, the if they were rich or if they were poor. They don't define anything about this man. And that's intentional, right? To show that it doesn't matter who that person is. If there is someone that needs help, it doesn't matter what their religion is or what their race is or what, right, if they are rich or if they are poor, anything, it doesn't matter, just that they are someone that needs help. So that's why it's important that they didn't give a person, a type of person to the man who needed help, because it wasn't about that. It was just someone that needs help. It's just representing anyone, all of us who need help. So now with those definitions, let's go through and read this again and see how it really changes how the story feels. So a man, right, any man, not described, was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him, and then they departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest, right, very highly looked upon, was going down that road, and when he saw him, the man, he passed on the other side. And now, so likewise, the Levite, who was the assistant to the priest, also very highly looked upon, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed on the other side of the road. But now a Samaritan, right, who you think is a bad person, right, the Samaritan, on his journey, came to where the man was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. So the Samaritan is the one who had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." So, right, so just those 4 definitions there really gave us more depth. We did understand the passage before, but now it gives us more depth as to why this passage would be called the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Because it's showing that the Samaritan was someone they thought was bad, but the Samaritan was being good in that moment. The Samaritan was the one helping that person, loving whoever it was, right? Loving our neighbor as ourselves without judging that person. And other people, right, just because of status doesn't mean that they're going to do the right thing. And of course, in this text as well, there are other references to the time period, right? Like he pours oil and wine on his wounds, and he puts the man on his animal, right? Because that would be like today if like you took someone and put them in your car. But at that time, right, of course, they're going to put it on the animal to use for transportation. And the denarii is the money of the time. But what's important about that section is we understand that the Samaritan did whatever he could to help that man, to help in any way that he could. So then it continues. And so Jesus asked the lawyer, "Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." So you can imagine how the lawyer felt in that moment, right? Because he didn't even say the Samaritan was the one who did good, right? He said the one who showed him mercy, the one who helped. So, right, we know the Samaritan was the one. And for the lawyer, right, the Samaritan was someone they judged so much. But now Jesus put this example of, you should love that Samaritan, right? The Samaritan is doing good, or it doesn't matter, right, if they're doing good or bad, but we have to love everyone. We have to be helping everyone. And Jesus said, you go and do likewise. Again, ironic for the lawyer to say, go and do like a Samaritan. Go do what that Samaritan did. Again, just showing to the lawyer that, right, to not judge people, because that's who our neighbors are. Our neighbors are everyone without judgment. Our ability to love without judgment. All people are our neighbors. And that's showing, right, not just the Samaritan was to the man, but also how the lawyer is to the Samaritan. So now with that, the book brings us 3 concluding points about this message. The first is to love God and neighbor is what we must do in order to achieve progress and full spiritual life. So, right, to love God and love our neighbor, that's what we have to do. But we have to do it. And that's how we'll achieve that full spiritual life. Again, we know we're all going to have that spiritual life. But what we're meaning is when it's full, when we're complete, we're at that state of perfection, of happiness, right? That is what we're all striving for. So it's not just about that spiritual life, but about getting to that happiness, which is what, right, everyone is striving for. The second message, concluding point that they bring is, it is important, but not enough to be aware of this. So again, right, it's great. It's important to study, to know things, to gain all this knowledge, but that's not enough. We need to put it into action. And that's something, I think about all the time, right? When we're studying, when we're preparing studies, when we're in studies, when we're reading, everything that we're doing, that's great. And that is a great step in the right direction, but that is not enough. Now we need to put those words into action, do those things that we're reading about, because that's when we'll really put it to the test and we'll really put it into practice and we'll really evolve ourselves and go towards perfecting ourselves, is when we're really doing those things, not just knowing them. And lastly, being our neighbor does not depend on the other person. It does not matter who the other person is, what their race, gender, religion, anything is, right? It's just about a person, a human being in need, right? Is how they said it. A human being in need. And we all are human beings in need. Everyone needs help in some way, shape, or form. So we have to help people the best way we can and love without judgment, without judging other people, without choosing who our neighbor is. Our neighbor is everyone. Think about it, right? We all share a planet. So we're all neighbors on this planet. And on other planets, right, we all share a galaxy. So we're all neighbors in a galaxy. So in all those senses, right, everyone is our neighbor. So then the book brings us this message here, the small quote to reflect on, which is, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. And this one is known as the golden rule. And this, I find so interesting, is taught even in non-religious circumstances, right? It's taught as treat others the way you want to be treated. So whatever you wish that others do to you, do also to them. Treat others the way you want to be treated. So, right, we've been taught that for so long. Everyone knows that rule. But do we put that into practice? Do we really do that? And of course, right, none of us are perfect. So of course we don't always do that, right? But that's what we need to be aware of. We need to realize, yes, we know this rule, but how can I put it into practice? How can I act on that? And that is going to make the difference in our lives. And lastly, the book leaves us off with this message to reflect on ourselves. So I will also leave you on this message to reflect on for yourself. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. So I'll leave you all with that message. And thank you all again so much for listening to this lesson, for supporting this book and all the lessons that are happening. I really encourage you to keep watching these lessons and read the book on your own. And it'll really just bring such a clarity and deeper meaning to these messages that we might know so well or we might not know, but it'll bring a new clarity there. So thank you all so much. So now I think we'll be getting into some questions. So we'll see if we have any questions coming up here. Great. How can we put into action the lessons that we learn? Right. So this is a hard question, right? We talk about, okay, we need to put that into action. We know all these stuff. We need to act on it. And of course, there's so many ways we can do this. But I think my biggest advice is to start small, is to do small things. Because if we try and do a big change, if we try and do everything all at once, that's not going to work out, right? We're not perfect yet. So we're not going to be able to handle all of that at once, all of that change, doing all of those things. But start small. Try and do something little each week, each month, right? Say, I'm going to practice this message. I'm going to practice this one teaching. Treat others the way you want to be treated. I'm going to practice that this week. I'm going to be conscious about it and make conscious choices that put that into action. So we just need to take small baby steps and it'll go so long, right? If we do one a week for just a year, that's 52 things that we worked on, right? And they can repeat. Of course, we're going to need more than a week to perfect them, but there's a lot there. If we break them into very small pieces, it'll be much easier. Can we fully master loving God and our neighbor in one incarnation? So as much, right, as we wish we could do that, we know that we are going to make mistakes and we're not going to be perfect. So as much as, we're working hard, we're going to have stumbles. So in one incarnation, that's not going to be possible. But that doesn't mean it's never going to happen, right? That is going to happen for all of us. We will all reach it. So the harder we work now, the more we work to put those things into action now, right? The closer we'll get there, right? But we will not be able to complete it all in this one incarnation. Let's see if there's another question. Do you think we still try to pick and choose who our neighbors are? Sadly, we still do. And we want to say, right, again, we judge the lawyer and we judge, it's easy to judge other people, right? But think about ourselves. We all still do that. And sadly, I think now in today's age, we are getting better at not consciously judging people, right? Not seeing someone and judging them. We are getting better at that. But I think subconsciously, we still pick and choose, right? Subconsciously, we still choose our friends or who we're going to talk to based on what maybe their outside characteristics are. If it's like ours, if it's different to ours, right? So we still unconsciously do that a lot, more than I think we do it consciously. So what we have to do is just, when we do something unconsciously, when we do realize it, just make a note of that and then be intentional about thinking about that. So you try not to do it again unconsciously, which is really hard to break those habits, but we will get there. When someone keeps asking for help and you help them over and over again, is there a point when you should stop helping them? So that's a great question. So first, to keep in mind that we can only help to our capacity, right? We need to make sure that we are helping ourselves first. We need to make sure that we are okay and ready to help. So it needs to be in our capacity. Just like on the airplane, when they give that message that you need to put on your oxygen mask before helping others, that's exactly it, right? Because if we help others, then we're going to run out of oxygen and we can't help anyone else. So what we need to do is help ourselves, make sure we're getting that oxygen, everything that we need, and then we'll be able to help others. So there is that capacity, right? That we have a limit. We can't just do everything. But whatever is in our capacity, then we should do it. Because what that other person is going to do with the help, how they're going to change, that's not up to us, right? That's up to them, how they're going to change, how they're going to use the help that we give them. But what we can do, what's up to us, is helping them, is us doing our part in helping them. Maybe we can try different methods to helping them. Maybe we can refer them to someone else that could help them, right? Maybe it doesn't mean that we'll be able to solve their issues, or maybe it's not the same way of helping is not efficient, but we should just keep trying our best in our capacity to help that person. Putting ourselves in the shoes of the lawyer, do you think we also do the same thing towards Spiritism? So that's definitely a great question. But I think in terms of, the studying and not practicing of the lawyer, right? The lawyer is so knowledgeable, but not practicing it. I think we do that a lot. And I think, again, right, it's a great step for us to be studying. Of course, we have to start there because once we study, now we know these things that we can go back and apply to our lives. But I think it's so easy to get lost in that, get lost in the just studying. And then when we're really facing those hard moments, that's when it's our chance to put that into practice. And I definitely think that is something, it is hard to do. And Jesus knew that, right? That's why Jesus gave us this message to the lawyer, to us still today, because that's a hard thing to do, to put it into practice. But that's the next step we need to work on, not just learning, but putting into practice. So I think that was all of the questions for today. So thank you all so much again for listening to this lesson. Again, I do encourage you to go out and get the book, read the book if you haven't, and follow along with the next lectures to come and the lectures beforehand as well. And read on your own, because really it will bring such clarity and understanding to these messages that we might think we know already. But it really is such an amazing book. So thank you all for watching this lecture and supporting this lecture series. Thank you.